The morning of October 25th, 1944, Admiral Takeo Kurita stood on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever constructed by human hands. Around him stretched a force that represented the concentrated striking power of the Imperial Japanese Navy. 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers, and somewhere ahead, through the grey dawn mist off Samar Island, American forces that had landed on Leyte just 5 days earlier. Kurita had already survived one sinking. Just 48 hours ago, American submarines had sent his flagship Atago to the bottom, forcing him to swim for his life in the dark waters of the Palawan Passage. Yesterday, American carrier aircraft had pounded his fleet for hours in the Sibuyan Sea, sending the mighty Musashi, Yamato's sister ship, to her grave after absorbing 19 torpedo hits and 17 bombs. He'd turned back twice, convinced the Americans had defeated him. But each time, Tokyo's orders had driven him forward. The fate of the Philippines, the fate of the entire southern resource area, perhaps the fate of Japan itself, rested on what happened in the next few hours. At 0644, lookouts spotted masts on the southeastern horizon. Kurita raised his binoculars. American carriers. His intelligence had been wrong about nearly everything else, but here, finally, was the target. The invasion fleet they'd been sent to destroy. What Admiral Kurita didn't know, what couldn't have known in that moment of grim satisfaction, was that he was looking at the wrong American fleet entirely. Those weren't the heavy fleet carriers of Task Force 38. They were 6 escort carriers, tiny Kaiser-class ships built for anti-submarine work, protected by just 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts. The mismatch was so absurd that within minutes, Kurita's officers would misidentify the escort carriers as fleet carriers and the destroyers as heavy cruisers, because nothing in their experience suggested the Americans would leave such pathetically weak forces exposed. In 72 hours, Admiral Kurita's powerful fleet would be shattered. 3 battleships gone, 10 cruisers sunk or crippled beyond repair. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had terrorized the Pacific for 3 years, would cease to exist as an offensive force. But the story of how that happened reveals something more profound than a simple tale of American victory. It reveals a navy that had forgotten how to win, trapped by assumptions that no longer matched reality, unable to adapt when the world they'd built their entire doctrine around collapsed beneath their feet. The Battle of Leyte Gulf would become the largest naval engagement in history. 4 separate actions spread across hundreds of miles of Philippine waters, over 200,000 naval personnel involved. More ships, more tonnage, more strategic significance than any naval battle before or since. But at its core, the battle revealed a fundamental truth about military power. That numbers matter less than how those numbers are used. That technological superiority means nothing without the wisdom to employ it. That confidence, untempered by reality, becomes the architect of its own destruction. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand how Japan lost the Battle of Leyte Gulf, you must first understand how completely they'd already lost the war by October 1944. The numbers told a story that Tokyo refused to acknowledge. At Leyte Gulf, the Japanese deployed virtually everything they had left. 7 battleships, 4 aircraft carriers, 19 cruisers, 33 destroyers. It looked formidable on paper. It was the largest Japanese naval force assembled since Midway. But the Americans? They had brought 32 aircraft carriers to the Philippines. 32. 12 fleet carriers and 20 escort carriers with 3rd Fleet alone. Another 18 escort carriers with 7th Fleet supporting the invasion. 12 modern battleships, 26 cruisers, over 140 destroyers. The disparity wasn't just in numbers, it was in everything those numbers represented. Japanese carriers arrived at Leyte Gulf, carrying fewer than 100 aircraft total between all 4 ships. American carriers brought over 1,000 aircraft. Japanese pilots averaged perhaps 100 hours of flight training. American pilots, 300 hours or more. Many were combat veterans with dozens of missions under their belts. Japanese fuel reserves were measured in weeks. The Americans brought enough fuel to sustain operations indefinitely, their tankers part of a logistics system so vast it defied Japanese comprehension. But perhaps most devastating was the intelligence gap. American code breakers had cracked Japanese naval codes years ago. They knew the Japanese plan for Leyte Gulf before some Japanese commanders did. They'd read the operational orders, understood the deception strategy, knew the routes, the timing, the composition of each force. The Japanese, by contrast, operated blind. Their reconnaissance aircraft were so few and so vulnerable that American fighters swept them from the sky before they could report. Their submarine fleet, once the terror of Allied shipping lanes, had been reduced to scattered remnants, unable to screen American movements or provide warning of American intentions. The Japanese plan for Leyte Gulf emerged from desperation dressed as boldness. It was called Sho Ichi Go, Operation Victory No. 1. The name itself revealed Tokyo's psychology. Not Operation Counterattack, not Operation Defense. Operation Victory, as if naming something could make it real. The plan was complex, perhaps too complex for a navy that no longer possessed the resources or coordination to execute complicated operations. 3 separate forces would converge on Leyte Gulf from different directions. Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa's northern force would steam down from Japan with 4 carriers, essentially empty of aircraft, serving as bait to lure away American fast carriers. While American attention focused north, 2 powerful surface forces would approach from the west. Admiral Shoji Nishimura's southern force, with battleships Fuso and Yamashiro plus a heavy cruiser and destroyers, would transit Surigao Strait and attack the American beachhead from the south. Simultaneously, Admiral Kurita's center force, the main striking arm with 5 battleships, including Yamato and Musashi, 10 heavy cruisers, and 15 destroyers, would transit San Bernardino Strait and attack from the north. Caught between these 2 powerful surface forces, with American carriers drawn away by Ozawa's sacrifice, the invasion fleet would be crushed. On paper, the plan held a certain desperate elegance. If everything worked perfectly, if Ozawa's carriers successfully drew away Halsey's Third Fleet, if Kurita and Nishimura arrived simultaneously at Leyte Gulf, if American submarines didn't detect them in transit, if American air power didn't decimate them before they reached the target, if. The plan assumed conditions that no longer existed, built on a foundation that had crumbled at Midway and shattered in the Philippine Sea. October 22nd, 1944, Brunei Bay, Borneo. Admiral Kurita's center force, assembled for what everyone understood might be a one-way mission. The briefing had been brutally honest. Intelligence suggested they faced overwhelming American naval strength. Air cover would be minimal and unreliable. Losses would be heavy. But if they could reach the invasion transports at Leyte Gulf, if they could smash the landing craft and supply ships, if they could drive American forces from Philippine waters, even temporarily, it might force negotiations, might delay the inevitable, might buy time for some miracle that would save the empire. The officers listened in silence. Some were veterans of Pearl Harbor, men who remembered when the Imperial Navy had been invincible, when American ships burned and Japanese forces advanced unopposed. Now they planned operations where success was measured not in territory seized but in days purchased, not in enemies destroyed but in enemies delayed. The battleships Yamato and Musashi dominated the anchorage, 72,000 tons each. 9 18.1-inch guns that could hurl 3,300-pound shells over 25 miles. Armor belts 16 inches thick. They were the largest, most powerful battleships ever built. Their designers had created them specifically to defeat any American battleship that might exist. No American ship mounted guns larger than 16 inches. No American battleship displaced more than 60,000 tons. In any gun duel, Yamato and Musashi would be superior. But October 1944 wasn't about gun duels between battleships. It was about carrier aircraft and radar-directed fire and logistics systems that kept fleets operational for months without returning to port. The super battleships represented engineering magnificence, solving problems that no longer mattered. On October 22nd, Kurita's force departed Brunei. 5 battleships, 10 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 15 destroyers. They represented nearly everything Japan had left. Steaming west, then north through the Palawan Passage, heading for San Bernardino Strait and the invasion beaches beyond. The crews were exhausted before they started. Japan's collapsing logistics meant inadequate food, limited ammunition, fuel barely sufficient for the mission. Many ships operated with partially trained crews, losses from earlier battles never fully replaced. The institutional knowledge that made navies effective, the veterans who understood their ships intimately and could diagnose problems by sound or feel, had been bled away over 3 years of attritional warfare. Nishimura's southern force departed separately. The battleships Fuso and Yamashiro were older vessels, built in the early 1910s and modernized between the wars. Their 14-inch guns couldn't match Yamato's firepower, but against transports and escort ships, they would be devastating. With the heavy cruiser Mogami and 4 destroyers, Nishimura would transit the Sulu Sea, pass through Surigao Strait south of Leyte, and fall upon the invasion fleet from below. Meanwhile, Admiral Ozawa sailed south from Japan's home waters with the northern force. His carriers Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda carried barely 100 aircraft between them, crews so inexperienced they could barely land safely on their own decks. But their mission wasn't to fight. It was to be seen. To draw Admiral Halsey's powerful Third Fleet north, away from Leyte Gulf. Ozawa understood he was the sacrifice. His carriers would likely be sunk, his crews would probably die. But if their deaths pulled American strength away from the invasion beaches long enough for Kurita and Nishimura to do their work, the sacrifice would be worth it. 3 forces, different routes, converging on one target. The Americans waiting at Leyte Gulf had no idea what was coming. Or perhaps more accurately, they knew exactly what was coming. They'd read the Japanese operational orders, decoded weeks ago. They understood the plan better than some Japanese commanders did. They were ready. October 23rd, 2:30 a.m., Palawan Passage. The submarines USS Data and USS Dace ran on the surface in the darkness, their diesel engines pushing them at maximum speed. Commander David McClintock on Data had picked up radar contacts an hour earlier, a large formation heading northeast through the passage between Borneo and Palawan Island. The 2 submarines raced ahead of the contacts, submerged before dawn, and waited. At 5:32 a.m., Data's periscope broke the surface. Through the lens, McClintock saw the silhouette of a heavy cruiser, close enough to see details on her bridge. He lined up the shot, waited until the geometry was perfect, and fired 6 torpedoes. The first torpedo struck Atago amidships. The second hit near the bow. The third and fourth slammed into her engineering spaces. Admiral Kurita's flagship erupted in flames and began to list. Kurita himself was thrown to the deck, scrambled topside as the ship capsized, and found himself swimming in fuel-oil-slicked water as his command ship sank in less than 20 minutes. 360 men went down with her. 10 minutes after the Atago hit, Data's stern tubes fired again, hitting the heavy cruiser Takao and crippling her so badly she had to turn back to Brunei escorted by 2 destroyers. The submarine Dace, not to be outdone, fired at the heavy cruiser Maya. 4 torpedoes struck home. Maya capsized and sank in less than 5 minutes. Within 30 minutes, the American submarines had sunk 2 heavy cruisers, crippled a third, and left Admiral Kurita treading water in the dark. It was not an auspicious beginning. Kurita was fished from the water by a destroyer, eventually transferred to the battleship Yamato, which became his new flagship. But the psychological impact couldn't be measured in ships lost. Center force had been detected. Surprise was gone. American submarines were hunting them, and they were still 2 days from their target. Kurita pressed on. What else could he do? Turn back meant failure. Advance meant probable death. But at least advancing offered the chance, however slim, of accomplishing something. October 24th. Sibuyan Sea. If the submarine attack had been a setback, what happened in the Sibuyan Sea was a catastrophe. Admiral Mark Mitcher's fast carriers launched wave after wave of strikes against Kurita's formation. The air attacks began at 10:30 a.m. and continued throughout the day. American dive bombers and torpedo planes swarmed the Japanese ships like angry hornets. The mighty Musashi became the focus of American attention, perhaps because she was so large, so impossible to miss. Perhaps because American pilots understood that sinking a super battleship would be a propaganda victory as well as a tactical one. Wave after wave concentrated on the giant vessel. The first attack at 10:30. Musashi took one torpedo hit, one bomb, suffered some flooding but maintained speed and formation. The second attack shortly after noon. More torpedoes, more bombs. Musashi began to list, her speed dropping. The third attack at 1:30 p.m., the fourth at 2:15, the fifth at 3 o'clock. By late afternoon, Musashi had absorbed 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs. Her bow was underwater, her list increasing, her speed down to 6 knots. At 7:30 p.m., with over 1,000 aero crew still aboard, Musashi rolled over and sank. The Japanese had designed her to be unsinkable. They'd given her armor and compartmentalization and damage control beyond any ship in history. But there's no armor thick enough to stop 20 torpedo hits. No compartmentalization sophisticated enough to contain that much flooding. No damage control capable of saving a ship whose entire bow has been blown away and whose engineering spaces are filling with the sea. Other ships in Kurita's force took damage. The battleship Yamato struck by 2 bombs. The heavy cruiser Myoko torpedoed and forced to retire. The battleship Nagato hit multiple times, but they kept coming, bloodied but advancing. Kurita briefly turned west, seemingly retreating, leading American pilots to believe they'd driven him off. Then, after sunset, with American aircraft returning to their carriers, Kurita turned back east, toward San Bernardino Strait, toward Leyte Gulf, 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers, battered but not beaten, still dangerous, still determined. Meanwhile, to the south, Admiral Nishimura approached Surigao Strait with his southern force, 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, 4 destroyers, a much smaller force, but against the thin-skinned transports and supply ships in Leyte Gulf, potentially devastating. American carrier strikes had found Nishimura's force during the day, scoring some hits but not stopping them. As darkness fell on October 24th, Nishimura entered the southern approach to Surigao Strait. He knew the Americans would be waiting. The strait was only 15 miles wide at its narrowest point, perfect for an ambush. But his orders were clear. Synchronize with Kurita, hit the invasion fleet simultaneously from north and south, trap them between 2 fires. Nishimura checked his watch. If Kurita maintained schedule, they'd arrive at Leyte Gulf within hours of each other. The Americans would be crushed between them. What Nishimura didn't know was that Admiral Kinkaid's 7th Fleet had been preparing for exactly this scenario. 6 old battleships, most of them raised from the mud of Pearl Harbor, had been positioned at the northern end of Surigao Strait. Battleships, Mississippi, Maryland, West Virginia, Tennessee, California, and Pennsylvania. Their crews had spent the day loading armor-piercing shells, calibrating their fire control systems, preparing for a night surface action. Behind them, cruisers and destroyers took position along both sides of the strait. It was a textbook ambush. The Japanese would sail directly into overlapping fields of fire with nowhere to maneuver. As October 24th turned to October 25th, 3 separate Japanese forces moved toward their targets. Kurita approaching San Bernardino Strait from the west, Nishimura entering Surigao Strait from the south. Ozawa deliberately making his presence known to the north, broadcasting radio signals, being spotted by American reconnaissance, doing everything possible to attract attention. The pieces were in position. The trap was set, and in the next 24 hours, the Imperial Japanese Navy would suffer losses from which it would never recover. October 25th, 3 a.m., Surigao Strait. Admiral Nishimura's southern force steamed north into darkness that concealed an overwhelming American presence. The battleships Fuso and Yamashiro led the formation, their 14-inch guns ready, their crews at battle stations. Behind them followed the heavy cruiser Mogami and 4 destroyers. They were steaming directly into the most perfectly executed naval ambush in history. The first warning came at 11:36 p.m. on October 24th, when American PT boats detected the Japanese formation entering the strait. The small patrol torpedo boats attacked repeatedly throughout the night, their torpedoes mostly ineffective, but their radio reports invaluable. They told Admiral Jesse Oldendorf exactly where the Japanese were, what course they were steering, what speed they maintained. Oldendorf's ambush had been planned with mathematical precision. Destroyers positioned along both flanks of the strait would make torpedo runs as the Japanese advanced. If anything survived those attacks, they'd sail directly into the concentrated gunfire of 6 battleships deployed in a line across the northern end of the strait. The Japanese would be silhouetted against the southern sky, the Americans hidden against the dark landmass to the north. Radar fire control systems would track targets the Japanese couldn't even see. At 3 a.m., the 1st American Destroyer Squadron attacked. Commander Jesse Coward's Destroyer Squadron 54 approached from the east, launched torpedoes from both sides of the Japanese formation, then turned away at high speed. The torpedoes ran hot, straight, and normal through the dark water. Multiple explosions lit the night. The destroyer Michishio erupted in flames and sank within minutes. The destroyer Yamagumo took a torpedo hit and went down. The destroyer Asagumo was crippled, forced to drop out of formation, and the battleship Fuso, hit by multiple torpedoes amidships, broke in half. Both sections remained afloat initially, burning fiercely, lighting the strait like enormous torches. The bow section would float for hours before finally sinking. The stern section, incredibly, continued to steam north under its own power, an autonomous fragment of a destroyed battleship, moving like a ghost ship toward the American battle line. Admiral Nishimura, aboard the flagship Yamashiro, didn't realize Fuso had been destroyed. In the darkness and confusion, he assumed she'd fallen behind but would catch up. He pressed forward with Yamashiro, Mogami, and 1 surviving destroyer, reduced to a fraction of his original strength, but still advancing, still committed to his mission. A 2nd destroyer squadron attacked. More torpedoes. Yamashiro took at least 1 hit, slowing her, damaging her machinery, knocking out several gun turrets. But she kept coming. Nishimura had orders. He would execute them or die trying. At 3:51 a.m., the American battleships opened fire. West Virginia's radar fire control locked onto Yamashiro at 22,000 yards. Her 16-inch guns spoke, sending 1-ton armor-piercing shells across 12 miles of darkness. Other battleships joined in. Tennessee, California, Maryland, Pennsylvania, the oldest and slowest battleships in the American fleet, veterans of Pearl Harbor, ships that had been written off as obsolete, now delivered devastating fire with modern radar systems that made darkness irrelevant. Yamashiro was hit repeatedly. 16-inch shells penetrated her armor belt, exploded deep inside her hull. 8-inch shells from American cruisers flanking the formation raked her superstructure. She burned from bow to stern, her list increasing, her speed dropping. 4:05 a.m. Torpedoes from American destroyers delivered the coup de grace. Yamashiro capsized and sank, taking Admiral Nishimura and most of her crew with her. The heavy cruiser Mogami, torn apart by gunfire, burning uncontrollably, managed to turn south and limp away. She would be finished off by air attacks the next morning. Only the destroyer Shigure, by some miracle of smoke and darkness and positioning, escaped relatively undamaged. The Battle of Surigao Strait was over in less than 2 hours. 2 battleships destroyed, 1 heavy cruiser mortally wounded, 3 destroyers sunk. American losses: 1 destroyer damaged by friendly fire. The last battleship versus battleship action in naval history had been utterly one-sided. Modern fire control, radar direction, and perfect positioning had allowed old American battleships to annihilate Japanese ships that never got close enough to fire effectively. But even as Nishimura's force was being destroyed in Surigao Strait, Admiral Kurita was approaching Leyte Gulf from the opposite direction, and the Americans had made a catastrophic mistake. Admiral William Halsey, commanding 3rd Fleet, had taken the bait. Ozawa's northern force had been spotted during October 24th. 4 Japanese carriers, apparently a major threat, steaming south toward the Philippines. Halsey made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He took every battleship, every carrier, every heavy cruiser of 3rd Fleet north to pursue and destroy Ozawa's force. San Bernardino Strait, the passage Kurita would use to reach Leyte Gulf, was left completely unguarded. No battleships, no cruisers, no destroyers, nothing. Halsey assumed that the previous day's airstrikes had crippled or turned back Kurita's center force. His intelligence suggested Kurita was retreating. Multiple pilots had reported seeing Japanese ships turn away to the west. What they hadn't seen was Kurita turning back after dark and continuing through San Bernardino Strait. At 3 m. on October 25th, the same hour Nishimura was being destroyed 200 miles to the south. Kurita's battered but still powerful force emerged from San Bernardino Strait and turned south toward Leyte Gulf. 4 battleships, including the mighty Yamato, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers. Between them and the invasion beaches, 3 groups of escort carriers, call signs Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3. 18 escort carriers total, designed for anti-submarine work and ground support, not fleet actions. Their thin hulls could be penetrated by destroyer shells. Their single 5-inch guns were intended to fend off aircraft, not engage battleships. Their fighter planes and torpedo bombers carried bombs and rockets for ground targets, not armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for naval combat. 0644 a.m. Japanese lookouts on Yamato spotted masts on the southeastern horizon. Admiral Kurita raised his prosopel, binoculars, carriers. Finally, after 3 days of air attacks and submarine ambushes and losses, finally they'd found the American fleet. He gave the order for general attack. His ships increased speed, broke formation, and charged toward what they believed was Task Force 38, Halsey's powerful fleet carriers. Within minutes, Yamato's 18.1-inch guns opened fire from over 25,000 yards. The 3,300-pound shells, each larger than a small car, straddled the escort carrier White Plains. Near misses buckled her hull, tripped circuit breakers, caused flooding. But she stayed afloat, turning desperately, launching every aircraft she had, calling for help that wasn't coming. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy 3, the northernmost of the escort carrier groups, found himself in an impossible situation. 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts. Facing 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and multiple destroyers. The most powerful surface force the Japanese could assemble against the weakest formation the Americans had in Philippine waters. Sprague had minutes to make decisions that would determine whether his force was annihilated or survived. He ordered his carriers to turn east, away from the Japanese, launching every aircraft they had regardless of armament. He ordered his destroyers to make smoke, laying thick chemical fog between his carriers and the approaching Japanese battleships. And then he ordered his destroyers to attack, not defend, attack, charge directly at a force that outweighed them 100 to 1. Buy time with their lives if necessary. The destroyer Johnston, commanded by Commander Ernest Evans, a half-Cherokee officer who'd told his crew on commissioning day that they would fight until the ship sank, turned toward the Japanese formation and accelerated to flank speed. Her 5-inch guns opened fire at maximum range, shells bouncing off the armoured hulls of Japanese heavy cruisers, but forcing them to manoeuvre, disrupting their attack. Johnston closed to 10,000 yards, impossibly close for a destroyer engaging cruisers, and fired a full spread of torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Kumano. The torpedoes struck home, blowing Kumano's bow completely off, taking her out of the fight. The heavy cruiser Suzuya stopped to assist, removing 2 ships from the Japanese attack just as it was building momentum. But Johnston paid the price for her audacity. A 14-inch shell from the battleship Congo penetrated her deck and exploded in her engine room. Her speed dropped by half. Secondary battery shells from Yamato struck her bridge, killing and wounding most of the bridge crew. Commander Evans, his left hand nearly severed, his shirt blown off, blood streaming from multiple wounds, continued directing his ship's fire from the open deck. The destroyer Hole joined the attack, charging Japanese battleships with the same suicidal courage. The destroyer Heermann, weaving between shell splashes, launched torpedoes that forced the massive battleship Yamato to turn away for 10 minutes, pulling her out of the fight at the crucial moment. Even the tiny destroyer escorts, ships 1/3 the size of fleet destroyers with a fraction of the armament, charged the Japanese line. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts closed to less than 5,000 yards from the heavy cruiser Chokai, so close that Japanese 8-inch guns couldn't depress low enough to hit her, and fired over 600 5-inch shells in continuous fire that set Chokai ablaze. When her guns ran out of regular ammunition, her crew loaded star shells and anti-aircraft rounds and kept firing. When a Japanese shell finally crippled her, and she began to sink, her crew abandoned ship singing the Navy hymn. The American destroyer and destroyer escort attack was suicidal, brave beyond comprehension, and shockingly effective. It forced Japanese ships to maneuver, individually rather than maintain formation. It drew fire away from the carriers. It sowed confusion about what they were actually facing. Kurita's staff misidentified the small escort carriers as fleet carriers, the destroyers as heavy cruisers. They believed they'd engaged a major American task force, not a collection of auxiliary ships. Meanwhile, the escort carriers launched every aircraft they had. Over 200 fighters and torpedo bombers that had loaded ground attack ordnance now faced Japanese battleships. They had no armor-piercing bombs, no torpedoes designed to penetrate battleship hulls, but they attacked anyway with whatever they carried. Depth charges meant for submarines dropped on cruiser decks, rockets intended for ground bunkers fired at battleship superstructures. Fighters with empty guns made dry runs, drawing anti-aircraft fire away from bombers. Some aircraft, completely out of ammunition, buzzed Japanese ships at mast height trying to distract them. Anything to disrupt their attack on the carriers. The carrier, Gambier Bay, slowest of the escort carriers, couldn't escape the pursuing Japanese cruisers. 8-inch shells struck her engineering spaces, her flight deck, her hull. At 9 a.m., overwhelmed by damage and flooding, she capsized and sank, becoming the only American carrier ever sunk by naval gunfire. But even as Gambier Bay went down, American aircraft struck back. A dive bomber from the escort carrier Kitkun Bay hit the heavy cruiser Chokai with a 500-pound bomb directly down her smokestack. The bomb detonated in her engine rooms, leaving her dead in the water. She would be scuttled hours later. The heavy cruiser Chikuma, battered by repeated aircraft attacks and destroyer gunfire, was abandoned and sank in the afternoon. The heavy cruiser Suzuya, damaged earlier by Johnston's torpedoes, took more bomb hits and had to be scuttled. At 9:25 a.m., just as Kurita's cruisers were closing within range to finish, off the remaining escort carriers, Admiral Kurita gave an order that shocked his subordinates. He ordered a general withdrawal. Turn around. Break off the attack. Head back through San Bernardino Strait. The invasion transports at Leyte Gulf, now virtually defenseless, lay less than an hour's steaming away. But Kurita had had enough. His force was scattered across miles of ocean, individual ships chasing targets in all directions. He'd lost 3 heavy cruisers with more damaged. American aircraft swarmed like hornets. Radio intercepts suggested another American carrier group approaching from the north. Intelligence, he decided, must have been wrong. This wasn't some auxiliary force. This was a major American fleet. If he pressed the attack, his remaining ships would be destroyed. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. He turned away. The decision would be debated for decades. Had Kurita pressed on, he might have reached the transports, might have inflicted catastrophic damage on the invasion fleet, might have delayed the liberation of the Philippines by months, or he might have lost every remaining ship Japan possessed, accomplishing nothing. We'll never know. What we do know is that his withdrawal saved what was left of his force and marked the point where the Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to be an offensive threat. The Battle off Samar ended with Taffy 3 having suffered brutal losses. The escort carrier Gambia Bay sunk. The escort carrier Strait, low struck by a kamikaze attack, the first organized use of suicide tactics, and sunk shortly after the surface action ended. The destroyers Johnston and Howell sunk. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts sunk, hundreds dead. But they'd stopped a force that should have annihilated them. They'd turned back 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and dozens of destroyers with nothing but courage, quick thinking, and desperation. Commander Ernest Evans, the captain of the destroyer Johnston, went down with his ship. Survivors reported seeing him standing on the fantail as Johnston rolled over, refusing to abandon his vessel. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The entire task unit received the Presidential Unit Citation. Admiral Sprague's after-action report was a masterpiece of understatement. The failure of the enemy to wipe out all vessels of this task unit can be attributed to our successful smokescreen, our torpedo counterattack, continuous harassment of the enemy by bomb, torpedo, and strafing air attacks, timely maneuvers, and the definite partiality of Almighty God. To the north, Admiral Halsey had found Admiral Ozawa's northern force and was in the process of destroying it. American carrier aircraft swarmed the Japanese carriers throughout October 25th. The fleet carrier Zuikaku, last survivor of the 6 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor, was sunk along with the light carriers Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda. The light cruiser Tama, multiple destroyers. Ozawa's mission to serve as bait had succeeded perfectly. He'd drawn away the entire American Third Fleet. But the sacrifice had been for nothing, because Kurita had turned back before reaching the invasion beaches. When Halsey received word that Kurita's force had emerged from San Bernardino Strait and was engaging Taffy 3, he turned his fleet south at maximum speed. But the distances were too great. Third Fleet would arrive hours too late. The most powerful naval force in the Pacific, with modern fast battleships and fleet carriers, would play no role in the decisive surface action. They'd been decoyed away, chasing empty carriers while escort carriers and destroyers fought for their lives 200 miles to the south. The controversy would shadow Halsey for the rest of his career. Admiral Chester Nimitz, normally diplomatic, sent Halsey a message that contained the devastating phrase, "Where is Task Force 34?" referring to the battleship formation that was supposed to be guarding San Bernardino Strait, but instead was hundreds of miles north. Halsey's defenders argued he'd made the right call. The destruction of Ozawa's carriers was a significant victory. His critics pointed out that escort carriers and destroyers had nearly been annihilated because he'd left them exposed. The debate continues. What's undeniable is that October 25th, 1944, saw some of the most desperate naval combat of the entire war compressed into a single day. At Surigao Strait, a perfectly executed ambush destroyed an entire Japanese force. Off Samar, desperate courage turned back what should have been an overwhelming attack. Off Cape Engano, American air power annihilated the last Japanese carrier force. When the sun set on October 25th, the Imperial Japanese Navy had ceased to exist as an offensive force. 3 battleships sunk. Ten cruisers lost. multiple destroyers destroyed. The survivors limped back to Japanese ports, many too damaged to ever return to combat. More devastating than the ship losses were the personnel casualties. Thousands of irreplaceable trained sailors died, officers with decades of experience, petty officers who understood their ship's systems intimately, pilots who could still perform carrier landings, all gone. Japan's training pipeline, already inadequate, couldn't replace these losses. Future naval operations would be crewed by men with minimal training, operating ships with damaged equipment, supported by a logistics system that was collapsing. The aftermath of Leyte Gulf revealed the full extent of Japanese defeat. The battleship Congo was sunk by an American submarine while trying to reach Japan. The heavy cruiser Kumano, limping home with her bow blown off, was sunk by air attack. The heavy cruiser Nachi was destroyed while under repair in Manila Bay. The cruisers Takao and Myoko reached Singapore, but were so damaged they never sailed again. They would sit in harbour, unable to move without fuel that Japan no longer possessed, until they were scrapped after the war. Of the major combatants that participated in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, very few would survive to see the war's end. Yamato, the mighty super battleship that had terrorized Taffy 3, would meet her end 6 months later during a suicide mission to Okinawa, destroyed by American carrier aircraft before she could reach the island. The pattern established at Leyte Gulf of overwhelming American air power annihilating Japanese surface forces would repeat. Nagato would survive only to be expended in atomic bomb tests at Bikini Atoll. Haruna would be sunk by carrier aircraft while in port, unable to move without fuel. Issei and Hyuga, the hybrid battleship carriers that had sailed with Ozawa, would be bombed to wrecks at anchor. Ship by ship, the proud fleet that had launched the war with stunning victories at Pearl Harbor and in Southeast Asian waters was reduced to scrap metal and memories. The strategic implications were immediate and permanent. The American landing at Leyte proceeded without naval interference. General Douglas MacArthur's promise to return to the Philippines had been fulfilled. The Japanese garrison on Leyte, cut off from resupply and reinforcement, would fight for months, but ultimate defeat was certain. The Philippines campaign would continue through early 1945, liberating the islands and severing Japan's access to oil from the Dutch East Indies. Without that oil, the surviving ships of the Japanese fleet couldn't sail. Without fuel for training, pilot quality declined even further. Without resources to repair battle damage, ships sat immobilized in ports. The Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered the greatest loss of ships and crew in its history at Leyte Gulf. It would never conduct another major offensive operation. The few sorties that followed were desperation moves. The final sortie of Yamato to Okinawa in April 1945 was explicitly a suicide mission. No fuel was allocated for return, no air cover provided. Just one last charge at the enemy before inevitable destruction. It was warfare as ritual sacrifice, not as military operation. The questions that emerge from Leyte Gulf extend beyond the tactical. Why did Kurita turn back when victory was within reach? Was he exhausted from 3 days of continuous operations? Had the ferocity of the destroyer attack convinced him he faced a much larger force? Did he lack the will to sacrifice his remaining ships for a mission he believed was already doomed? We'll never know his full reasoning. He gave contradictory explanations in different post-war interviews. Perhaps he himself didn't fully understand his own decision. Why did Halsey chase Ozawa's decoy force so completely that he left San Bernardino Strait unguarded? His orders from Nimitz were contradictory. Protect the invasion forces, but also seek out and destroy the Japanese fleet. When presented with what appeared to be 4 Japanese carriers, the ultimate target for any carrier admiral, could he have resisted? Should he have left even a small force to cover the strait? The debate continues. What's certain is that the confusion nearly resulted in disaster for Taffy 3. Only exceptional courage saved them. Why did Nishimura proceed into Surigao Strait, knowing it was almost certainly a trap? Japanese military culture demanded absolute execution of orders regardless of circumstances. To turn back would have been to abandon the plan. To fail in one's duty, death in combat was preferable to the shame of withdrawal. That cultural imperative, admirable in some ways, led directly to the pointless destruction of an entire force in a battle that was lost before the first shot was fired. The human stories from Leyte Gulf are staggering. American sailors who fought on despite wounds that would have incapacitated most men. Japanese crews who remained at their posts as their ships sank around them. Destroyer captains who charged battleships knowing they wouldn't survive. Pilots who flew mission after mission until their aircraft broke down or they were shot down. The individual acts of courage on both sides deserve respect, even as we recognize the enormous strategic mistakes and institutional failures that made such courage necessary. The mathematics of Leyte Gulf reveal the reality of industrial warfare in its full brutality. Japan deployed everything they had. The United States deployed a fraction of what they possessed. Japan lost most of what they sent. The United States replaced their losses within weeks. Japan's remaining ships sat in port for lack of fuel. American ships continued operations indefinitely, supported by a logistics system that kept them supplied, maintained, and armed. One side fought with the resources of a single island nation whose supply lines were collapsing. The other fought with the resources of continental North America, plus British and Australian support. The disparity had always existed, but by late 1944 it had become overwhelming. The Battle of Leyte Gulf didn't change the trajectory of the Pacific War. That trajectory had been set at Midway, confirmed in the Solomons, made irreversible with the conquest of the Marianas. What Leyte Gulf did was remove the last instrument capable of challenging American naval supremacy. After October 26, 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy existed only as scattered remnants, unable to conduct fleet operations, unable to protect supply lines, unable to contest American advances. The path to Japan's home islands now lay open. In the decades since, Leyte Gulf has been analysed endlessly. It was the largest naval battle in history by most measures. More ships engaged, more tonnage involved, fought across wider areas. But its significance lies not in size but in consequences. It marked the moment when one navy ceased to function as a coherent force, when admirals could no longer risk their remaining ships because they had no replacements, when pilots couldn't be sent on missions because there were no trained pilots left, when fuel shortages meant ships sat idle regardless of damage status. The battle demonstrated that modern naval warfare wasn't about individual ship quality or tactical brilliance. It was about systems. Logistics systems that kept fleets operational, training systems that replaced losses, industrial systems that built ships faster than enemies could sink them, communication systems that coordinated operations across thousands of miles, intelligence systems that revealed enemy intentions before execution. Japan had excellent ships, highly trained crews at the war's beginning, a naval tradition stretching back decades, but they lacked the industrial base to sustain operations after initial losses. They lacked the logistics to support forces far from home waters. They lacked the flexibility to adapt when their carefully planned operations collapsed. Most fatally, they lacked the ability to acknowledge that they were losing until defeat had become irreversible. The Americans had advantages Japan couldn't overcome: industrial capacity that produced weapons faster than they could be destroyed, a logistics system that projected power across the Pacific, technology advantages in radar, communications, and fire control. Most importantly, institutional flexibility that allowed rapid adaptation to changing circumstances. When early war torpedo failures were identified, they were fixed. When carrier doctrine proved inadequate, it was revised. When commanders made mistakes, they were relieved and replaced. The system corrected itself continuously. The Japanese system, constrained by rigid military culture and unwillingness to acknowledge problems, often perpetuated errors rather than correcting them. Torpedo problems persisted throughout the war. Tactical doctrine remained largely unchanged from 1941. Commanders who failed upward because removing them would have been admission of error. The institutional sclerosis that prevented adaptation also prevented effective response to American advantages. The story that began with Admiral Kurita spotting carrier masts at dawn on October 25th ended with the Imperial Japanese Navy reduced to irrelevance. 72 hours from that first sighting, 3 battleships lost, 6 heavy cruisers sunk, 4 light cruisers destroyed, dozens of smaller vessels gone, thousands of irreplaceable sailors dead, and nothing accomplished. The invasion of Leyte proceeded. The Philippines would be liberated, Japan's access to oil severed. The war's outcome, already certain, now inevitable. For the men who fought at Leyte Gulf, both American and Japanese, the experience marked them permanently. Survivors of Taffy 3 would tell stories of that morning off Samar for the rest of their lives. The image of destroyers charging battleships, of carriers desperately zigzagging between shell splashes, of aircraft making dummy runs with empty guns. Japanese survivors, fewer because their ships suffered higher casualty rates when sunk, carried different memories. Of watching Musashi absorb impossible damage before finally succumbing. Of Yamashiro's guns falling silent in Surigao Strait. Of turning away from victory because exhaustion and confusion made advance seem more dangerous than retreat. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The rejected titles claim that Japan sent 11 battleships needs clarification. Japan deployed 7 regular battleships plus 2 hybrid battleship carriers, 9 capital ships total. The title's number appears rounded for impact or includes ships from all forces, but the substance remains accurate. Japan committed virtually its entire remaining battle fleet. 3 battleships were sunk during the battle: Musashi, Fuso, and Yamashiro. Additionally, 6 heavy cruisers were lost: Atago, Maya, Mogami, Suzuya, Chokai, and Chikuma. The 72-hour time frame captures the battle's main phases from October 23rd through October 26th. The losses were catastrophic and permanent. The lesson extends beyond naval history into fundamental questions about how military power functions. Superior technology means nothing without the systems to employ it effectively. Individual excellence cannot overcome institutional dysfunction. Courage, however extraordinary, cannot substitute for adequate resources and sound strategy. The Battle of Leyte Gulf demonstrated all these principles with brutal clarity. Japan brought excellent ships operated by brave crews executing a well-designed plan, and lost decisively because they were attempting to win a war they'd already lost at the strategic level. The Americans brought overwhelming resources, institutional flexibility, and the ability to replace losses faster than they occurred. Individual battles might be close, individual engagements might be uncertain, but the cumulative weight of sustained operations would inevitably crush Japanese resistance. Today, Leyte Gulf serves as a case study in military academies worldwide, studied for Oldendorf's perfect execution of crossing the T at Surigao Strait, analysed for Halsey's controversial decision to pursue Ozawa, taught as an example of how desperate courage by Taffy 3's escorts saved a situation that should have been catastrophic, examined for what it reveals about command decisions under stress and the fog of war. But perhaps its deepest lesson is about hubris and miscalculation. Japan had initiated the Pacific War, believing that swift victories would force American acceptance of a new order in Asia. They'd calculated that American will would break before American industry could mobilize. They'd assumed that initial Japanese advantages in training and equipment would prove decisive. Every assumption proved wrong. American will didn't break. American industry not only mobilized but exceeded every projection, and initial Japanese advantages eroded, then reversed, then became catastrophic disadvantages. By October 1944, Japanese leaders understood they'd lost, but they continued fighting, partially from honor, partially from hope that casualties might force negotiations, partially because the alternative was unthinkable. The Battle of Leyte Gulf represented one final attempt to inflict enough damage to change the war's trajectory. It failed comprehensively. The ships that sailed into battle would never threaten Allied operations again. The era of the battleship as the dominant capital ship ended not with a whimper, but with Yamato's massive guns firing at escort carriers off Samar. The irony was complete. The largest battleship ever built, created specifically to dominate any gun duel, found herself shooting at tiny carriers while being harassed by aircraft and destroyers. The weapon system was obsolete, the tactics were obsolete, the strategy was obsolete, but the men who served deserved better than to be spent in operations that couldn't succeed. The escort carriers and destroyers of Taffy 3, outmatched and outgunned, turned back a force that should have annihilated them through courage that deserves to be remembered. The Japanese sailors who went down with their ships did so, serving a cause that was already lost, but serving it with honor nonetheless. War is tragedy, wearing different uniforms. Both sides at Leyte Gulf demonstrated extraordinary courage. One side also possessed the industrial might and strategic position to make that courage decisive. The other side's courage, however admirable, couldn't overcome mathematics. The Battle of Leyte Gulf stands as testament to the brutality of industrial warfare and the futility of fighting on when strategic defeat has already occurred. The ships that went down carried men who deserved better than to be sacrificed in battles that couldn't be won, on both sides. But history is written by outcomes, not intentions. And the outcome of Leyte Gulf was unambiguous. The Imperial Japanese Navy had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force, removing the last obstacle to American victory in the Pacific.